I'm familiar with the concern about mass incarceration, and I share it. Mass incarceration is reflected, for example, in the 1980s era drug statutes that had mandatory minimums um, for drug offenses, for drug possession offenses, that had three strikes laws, where often the third offense was something that was relatively less significant than was leaving uh, some defendants being subjected to 25 years to life in California. And I have supported reforms in those laws. What Prop 36 is dealing with is a whole different set of offenses at a much less lower level of severity of punishment. And we're really typically talking about overwhelmingly cases that end up in probation. And if there's any sentence at all, it's probably a few days in jail. But here's what I know what works. And what works is our programs like Operation Hope in Honolulu. That is a program that's focused on breaking the very strong nexus between addiction and crime. And the criminological data is very clear on this about what is driving a lot of criminal activity. It's often opiate addiction around theft. It's often methamphetamine addiction around violence. And we need to break those addictions. And the way to do so is through a combination of treatments and certain consequences. And every drug court judge I know who that I have talked to, who is, and this is usually a pretty progressive share of jurists on the bench. These are folks who believe in alternative approaches to avoid incarceration. And what they are uniformly telling me is, we are never getting the defendants to come in front of us to the point where we can tell them, you have a choice. You can go to jail or you can go to treatment. And if they are never presented with that choice, they're never going to go to treatment, and they're going to continue using, because we know that is the path of addiction. But whatever it is, there's going to be a consequence. It doesn't have to be severe. We know from the criminological literature that severity of punishment doesn't deter crime. What does deter crime is the certainty of punishment. So it doesn't have to be severe. It can be modest, but there has to be an arrest and there has to be accountability, or you're never going to break the cycle of addiction and resulting crime. We have to be pragmatic about the political landscape. In my book, and I know you've all read the book, I'm sure. And if you haven't, it's going to become a major motion picture. But it's 80 pages now, and I think it's growing on the website. It's going to be more than 100 soon. What I describe are really how we can focus and start in those areas where we know Republican voters actually support sensible gun restraints. For one thing, we need to close the loopholes on background checks. And right now, about 45% of guns are being sold through unregistered dealers who don't have to subject buyers to background checks. So let's have background checks. Secondly, we need to regulate ammunition. And there seems to be strong support among voters, at least on both sides of the aisle, for some restrictions and constraints on the amount of ammunition that gets sold, and on doing criminal background checks on ammunition purchases, which could have a really significant impact, it seems to me. Third, I think we need a federal red flag law. We have red flag laws in 21 states. I think it's critical for us to have a uniform federal red flag law, because we've seen how weak red flag laws like those in Maine were very inadequate in the case of that mass shooting last year involving an Army reservist, where everybody knew, hey, we got to get guns away from this guy. And they tried to go through the court process, and it was just too labyrinthine, and they couldn't get through it. So we need a strong red flag law, and then we need it to be federal. And so those are some examples where I think we need to try to work in those purple districts with those ideas that we think we can get Republican voters on board for, and take this very incrementally, because we're not going to get some comprehensive gun law passed in a divided Congress. This Congress is going to be divided after November. Looks like we're gonna have a Republican Senate, Democratic House. And that means folks are going to have to get out of their corners and talk to each other.
So you're suggesting a federal law that only that would be amenable to purple, or you're saying go to those states and work in those purple states first?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a network, and I've worked with folks, Moms Demand Action, Every Town, other organizations, Brady. They are very good in working in grassroots situations to build support, to support those lawmakers who might be courageous enough to listen um, to voters in those districts. And so I think this is going to take a bottom-up approach of activism combined with strategic legislation, and we have to work in concert with those kinds of organizations to see what we can get over the goal line. And I think we have to keep it simple. If we make it complex, then the other side is going to spin it in all kinds of ways. So let's start and make it piecemeal and do it bit by bit. I think a majority of Americans support the idea of sensible restrictions on ammunition sales. Let's just start there.